started? Okay, so today's session is going to provide you with a quick review of the identification criteria and the requirements for additional targeted support and improvement, or ATSI, which hopefully you got a chance to learn about if you attended one of the ATSI informational sessions last week, but we'll give you a quick refresher on that. And then the focus of today's presentation is really to provide you an overview of how to access and complete the 23-24 SPSA specifically for non-Title I ATSI schools. I'll also go over the SPSA submission and approval timeline. And finally, I'll share some SPSA development resources with all of you. Now, if you recall from last week's sessions, the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, requires that states identify schools based on one of three categories: comprehensive support and improvement, or CSI, targeted support and improvement, or TSI, and what your school was identified for, which is additional targeted support and improvement, or ATSI. Now, this session is specifically for all of you non-Title I schools who are identified as ATSI. And so this includes schools that have either never been identified before. It can also include schools that are continuing in ATSI status, either because they still meet the identification criteria, or putting it another way, did not meet the exit criteria. It can also include schools that exited CSI, but now meet ATSI identification criteria. Now, if, again, you recall from last week's sessions, ATSI schools were identified this past January of 2023 based on 21-22 data, and will be identified again in January 2024, and then every 3 years after that. Your school was identified for student group performance on the California dashboard for either being lowest status on all indicators or lowest status on all indicators but one. And again, as a refresher, this year's dashboard is no longer based on those color combinations such as red and orange that we're used to from prior years. This year, students are only identified based on status, which is on a scale from very low, low, medium, high, and very high. Excuse me. For all the academic indicators, such as graduation, ELA, math, EL programs, the lowest status category is considered very low. However, for chronic absenteeism and suspension, it's the opposite. The lowest status category is very high because we don't want our absenteeism and suspension numbers to be on the high end of that scale. And just so you know, your school can exit annually from this ATSI designation. Now, if the school remains in ATSI status for more than 4 years, then it will become a CSI school. Now, as a refresher from last week's training, this slide illustrates an example of ATSI identification based on that criteria that I just shared in the previous slide. So looking at this example, foster youth students were identified as ATSI because of the two indicators that were measured or reported, in this case, chronic absenteeism and suspension, and both were very high, which is the lowest status category. Now, looking at African-American students and students with disabilities in this same example, those students were also identified as ATSI, in this case because all but one indicator was at the lowest status level. So if you see both groups, chronic absenteeism was very high, which is the lowest level. ELA and math were very low, which for the academic content areas, that's considered the lowest level. Suspension was medium, so that one is okay. It's not at the lowest level, but all the other indicators but that one for suspension were at the lowest level. So that's why those two student groups were also identified as ATSI. Okay. Now, you'll notice here on this example that there are some indicators that don't have a report at all. And that's for one of two reasons. Either because it doesn't apply to the grade span, because, for example, graduation would not apply to elementary or middle schools, or because the N size or the student group number is less than 30 students. So in cases when there are less than 30 students reported, you would not see a status report for that indicator. That's why you see some blanks in this example. Here's another example illustrating that 4 different student groups, African American students, Hispanic students, socioeconomically disadvantaged students, and students with disabilities are also identified as ATSI because all indicators but one are at the lowest level. You can see the red highlighted indicators, chronic absenteeism, ELA, math, were all at the lowest level. The one that wasn't is suspension. However, all indicators but one were at the lowest level, and that's why those 4 student groups were identified as ATSI. When you attended last week's sessions, hopefully I hope you got a chance to review your own individual school report. If you did not get an opportunity to attend last week's sessions, at the end of this presentation, when we share resources, we'll show you how you can access your own individual school report to see specifically which student groups at your school site were identified as ATSI. Now, in order to exit ATSI status next year, your school would have to no longer meet identification criteria and either have at least one of the indicators that led to identification improved by a value of at least 0.1 for the identified student group or groups that were specifically identified for your school, or if the number of students reported ends up being less than 30, then they wouldn't get a status, and that's another way to exit as well. Now, as mentioned in last week's training sessions, ATSI schools are required to write a plan, which in this case is the SPSA, or School Plan for Student Achievement, that's informed by all state indicators for which the school was identified. It's based on the findings of a comprehensive needs assessment, and it identifies resource inequities and includes evidence-based interventions that meet the ESSA criteria. Excuse me. The SPSA plan is approved and monitored by the school and the district. Now, everything I just covered with you was a recap of what you learned at last week's ATSI trainings. Now, which brings us to the main focus for today, which is to go over how you can access and complete the 23-24 SPSA as a non-Title I ATSI school. You can access the SPSA from our federal and state education programs homepage. The link is included on this slide. You would just follow those 3 steps. 1, click on School Plan for Student Achievement in the left navigation menu. 2, from the drop-down selection, click on Online SPSA. And 3, click on Launch Online SPSA Template. On the login screen, you would type in your single sign-on, enter your password, and then click on Login. You should only see your school there unless you're assigned to multiple school sites. Then you would need to select the specific school, and you select the school year, which right now automatically defaults to the 23-24 school year. Once you're logged in, you will see your school displayed on the SPSA main dashboard page, which looks like this. Now, let's talk about which sections of that you're required to complete. All of the different tabs or sections are on the left navigation menu. The first tab to complete in the template is the school identification page, which is the very first tab. As the school administrator, you should verify that the information on this page is accurate and update it as necessary. If you need to update the SPSA contact, as the principal or the AP can delete an existing contact person by clicking on the delete contact button. You will then get a pop-up window asking you to confirm that you want to delete the existing contact. And once you click on delete, that contact person and their email will be deleted from the school identification page. Now, to add an SPSA contact person, the administrator can click on the Add Contact button, type in the first name, type in the last name, and then you'll see a list displaying the names typed in when you click on the search button. Then you'll click on the select button next to the name of the contact person you would like to add, save, and close. And the contact person is going to be that primary point of contact for us for anything related to this SPSA plan. The SPSA contact person's name and email will then display on the school identification page. And when you save that contact person, he or she will also be automatically added as a designee in the list of designees link. And likewise, when the SPSA contact is deleted, they'll automatically be deleted from the designee list. Now, the distinction between a contact and a designee is, again, the contact is going to be our primary point person for all things related to the SPSA plan, whereas you can have multiple designees who you give access to at the school site that can log into the SPSA and support the plan writing, but we only have one primary point of contact. Okay, but you can have multiple designees. In this case, the contact person also gets assigned as a designee. The principal or AP are also the only staff who can add or delete a designee. To add or remove a designee, the principal or AP can click on the list of designees button on the same school identification page. And then to add the designee, you can click on Find User and search for the person by entering just the first name, last name, or both. When you click on the search button, you'll find a list of matching names. Once that person is located, click on the select link next to the person's name, and then click on the Add User button, and a date and timestamp will display when a designee has been added. Okay. You cannot select an AP as a designee because the AP has the same user role as a principal and therefore has automatic access to the SPSA as long as he or she is assigned to your school location code. So you won't even see the select button available for the AP. The one exception to this is the AP EIS. They're assigned to the regional cost center and not your school's location code. And so they will not have automatic access to your school plan. Okay. Now, also, if you want to, as an administrator, delete a designee, you have that trash can in the far right column that you can remove a designee, which means they will no longer have access to log into your school's plan. So that's the first tab that you're required to complete as a non-Title I ATSI school, the school identification page. The next tab to complete in the SPSA is the Recommendations and Assurances tab, which is right below that. If the school is required to have an English Language Advisory Committee or ELAC, enter the date of recommendations from ELAC for the development of this plan and type in the name of the ELAC chairperson. If the ELAC is not applicable for your school because you have less than 21 English learner students, you can click on the NA box. Now, when you click on the Save button, any required fields that have not been completed are going to display in orange. So these are the other fields that are required for this particular tab. In this section, you'll type in the name of other committees other than ELAC that contributed to developing the required sections of the SPSA for your school and click the Add button. So think about committees that you already have at your school site, leadership committees or decision-making committees that you have. You can engage them in this plan development process. You'll also enter the date the school plan was adopted by the stakeholders or committees that you listed. So you'll just put in the primary date when your primary decision-making group at your school approved this plan. Now, we know that as a non-Title I school, you're not required to have a school site council. So in lieu of the school site council, you will, where it says type SSC chairperson name, you'll put in NA for the name of the SSC chairperson. Now, for the date next to that, you'll select the date that the committee or committees that approve the plan enter that date in for the date that it was approved by your other stakeholder committees. And then you'll also check the appropriate text box for either the e-signature or decline to sign by the committee head acting in lieu of an SSC chair. So whoever heads your primary decision-making committee at your school, you can go ahead and enter e-signature on their behalf, just indicating that they've approved the development of this plan. And again, this is in lieu of having an SSC at your school site And then as the principal, you would enter the date that you approve this plan and check the principal e-signature box and save. So that's the second tab that you're required to complete. So far, the school identification tab and the recommendations and assurances tab. Now, the next tab in the SPSA that you're required to complete is the comprehensive needs assessment tab. On this tab, you're going to reflect your review process, reviewing your ATSI identification data, what led to your identification with your stakeholders, you're analyzing data, you're addressing the needs of your students, and that self-review process and that needs assessment process that you engage in, you're going to reflect it on this tab. So you'll select all committees or groups that participated in this needs assessment process from a drop-down list. You'll describe what happened in the meetings with each of those committees. You'll select the dates that those meetings occurred and save that information. Now, at minimum, your needs assessment process should reflect a review of the data that led to your school's ATSI identification and a discussion of how to address those needs through your resource inequities and evidence-based interventions, which I'll cover in the upcoming slides. So the next tab that you will complete is that resource inequities and evidence-based interventions tab. Now, before we talk about addressing resource inequities in your plan, it's important that we develop a common understanding of what we mean by resource equity so that you can identify when there are barriers or factors impacting your school's ability to ensure equity for your students and therefore resulting in resource inequities. So here we define resource equity as the allocation and use of resources, which can include people, time, and money to support and enable students to meet or reach rigorous achievement outcomes. Now, conversely, resource inequities might exist when those resources are non-existent or not utilized effectively to support our students in meeting those rigorous outcomes. Identifying resource inequities may include ways in which a program at your school may be unfair to a particular group of students or lack inclusion. So think of those students that were identified for ATSI. Were they excluded from participating in any of your programs, even unintentionally? It's also important to understand the distinction between equality and equity when we consider possible resource inequities. Equality means that all our students get the same resources and support regardless of their needs, whereas equity means that we recognize that some students come to school with greater needs and therefore require greater resources to reach the same high learning outcomes. Okay? Now, it's also equally important when we consider resource inequities to consider areas in our school programs in which some students are not held to the same high standards as their peers. So while it's important that we differentiate instruction for our students, We have to be careful, though, that that differentiation doesn't result in holding them to less rigorous standards or expectations. Instead, what we want to do is leverage our resources to ensure that we provide those students with the scaffolds and tools that they need to meet the same rigorous high standards as other students. Now, this is by no means a comprehensive list, but some examples of resource inequities might include lower quality books and instructional materials for some students, or maybe less access to resources, such as labs like science or computer labs. Perhaps outdated technology equipment that's impacting the learning, or significantly larger class sizes for certain grade levels or student groups. Less qualified or experienced teachers being assigned to the most at-risk students, or maybe lack of exposure to grade level or core content, maybe due to classroom settings or alternative curriculum settings for certain students or student groups. And again, this is not a comprehensive list, but just some examples to get you thinking about possible inequities that might exist at your particular school site. Now, through that lens, you will answer 4 questions in the resource inequities section of this tab. Question number 1, what actionable inequities were identified by the school? Number 2, which inequities are priorities for the school to address? Number 3, how will the school address these inequities? And question number 4, if relevant, describe any resource inequities that were identified during the review that are not actionable at the school site, but which impact student achievement. And if not relevant, you can write NA in the text box. So for that last question, number 4, we know that some inequities might exist that are outside of your school's control, maybe things that are occurring at the home, or initiatives that maybe you can't control at the school site, but might be more at the central office level. You can still identify those inequities as barriers that are impacting your students, even though you might not have control over them. And again, if it doesn't apply to your school for that last question, you can simply write NA. That's the first part of this Resource Inequities Evidence-Based Interventions tab, answering those 4 questions for the resource inequities. The second half of it is the evidence-based interventions. So you will describe one evidence-based intervention that your school will implement to address the needs of your identified student group or groups. And by intervention, we don't necessarily mean an intervention in that traditional sense that we think of. It can be an activity, a strategy, a program, or a traditional intervention that you run after school or during the school day. Now, more importantly, the intervention that you select must meet one of the following ATSI criteria. It has to be classified as either strong, which would be a well-designed, randomized experimental study with statistically significant results, meaning that the students who received the intervention were selected randomly and that that intervention produced good results for those students. The second category is moderate, a well-designed study that's quasi-experimental in that it's not randomized, but still shows statistically significant and positive effects, meaning that the students who received the intervention were deliberately selected, but we still saw improved results for the students in that focus group that were specifically selected for the intervention. The third category is promising, which is a well-designed correlational study that shows a connection or a correlation between an intervention and improved student achievement. And the last category is demonstrates a rationale, which would be research or findings or a program evaluation that suggests that an intervention is likely to result in improved student outcomes. In this evidence-based intervention section, you will address 9 questions or prompts. Number 1, you'll indicate the student group or groups that will be the focus of this evidence-based intervention. And those should be your student groups, ideally that were identified for ATSI. Number 2, you'll indicate all dashboard indicators that this evidence-based intervention addresses. And again, the indicators you select ideally should include the ones that you were identified for as ATSI. Number 3, you'll indicate the evidence rating for the intervention. That's that strong, moderate, promising, or demonstrates the rationale that I just referenced. Number 4, you're going to indicate the source that was used to determine the evidence rating. I'll talk about the sources more on the next slide. Number 5, you would indicate if this is a new or continuing intervention at your school site. So you're not required to reinvent the wheel and start a new intervention. If you already have an intervention that addresses the needs of your identified student groups, you can continue using that. Number 6, indicate the name of the evidence-based intervention. So you're simply going to tell us the name of this intervention. If, for example, you're using IXL Math, that's the name of your intervention. Number 7, you're going to actually describe the evidence-based intervention and the funding source. So we want you to assume that we don't know what this intervention is. You're going to give us a brief overview of what this intervention is and describe it for us and tell us how you're funding it using one of your program funds. Number 8, you're going to describe how the evidence-based intervention will be evaluated and note clearly the measurable outcomes you will use to measure effectiveness. In other words, how are you going to know that this intervention works? Are you going to have a pre and a post assessment or some other data to look at to let you know that this intervention is effective? Now, for the last question, number 9, if the response to question 5 is that this is a continuing intervention, we want you to cite data that supports the claim that this intervention is actually producing improved achievement results for your students. If the data doesn't indicate there is progress, what are you going to do differently? Tell us that in question 9. Now, if the response to question number 5 is that it's a new intervention, then for question number 9, you would simply write NA in that box. Now, we've tried to simplify the process of identifying the evidence rating for an intervention by providing you with links to sources in that intervention section that will help provide the evidence rating for the intervention that you select. And specifically, what we have on that page are 3 main sources of evidence-based interventions: What Works Clearinghouse, Evidence for ESSA, and our LAUSD evidence-based intervention bench for state-identified schools. If the intervention that you select is not listed on one of those sites, then you can check an other box that's there and put in a link to a study that supports the evidence rating for the intervention that you selected. And if you're having difficulty with that, if you cannot find it on those sites and have to select your own, you can reach out to us for additional support if you're having difficulty finding a study that might support the evidence rating. So to sum up the requirements for the evidence-based interventions and resource inequities tab, you will complete the 4 resource inequities questions, and then you will complete questions 1 through 9 for the evidence-based interventions. The minimum requirement is to have 1 evidence-basst intervention. If your school elects to have more than 1 intervention, you can click on the Add New button to add another page and list another intervention. But again, the minimum requirement is just 1. So just to sum up so far, we've talked about 4 different tabs that you're required to complete: the School Identification tab, the Recommendations and Assurances tab, the Comprehensive Needs Assessment, and the Evidence-Based Interventions and Resource Inequities. The next part that you will complete is the pillar pages that are aligned to the district strategic plan. We'll talk about specific parts of that you will complete. The pillar pages include a tab for academic excellence, which is pillar number 1 in the strategic plan. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. When you click on that Academic Excellence tab, a drop-down of sub-pillars is going to appear, including graduation, college, career, ELA, math, EL programs, and other academic content. That other academic content is intended to address content areas like science and social studies. We also have a tab for pillar number 2, joy and wellness, and a tab for pillar number 3, engagement and collaboration. The joy and wellness tab is intended to address attendance, suspension, and social emotional supports for students. And the engagement and collaboration tab is intended to address student, staff, and parent engagement. Now, as a non-Title I ATSI school, you don't have to address all the different components in those pillar pages. Specifically, what you're going to address are the following parts or sections: the data sources that you reviewed, the key findings, which will be question number 1 in each of those pillars, related to the data sources that you reviewed, and question number 2, the root cause analysis related to the key findings and the data that you reviewed. Okay. Now, since many of the schools here today are likely identified for chronic absenteeism, just know that you would address that status in the joy and wellness pillar. But again, you're not addressing all the different parts of the pillar. You're just going to focus on those 3 sections: data sources, key findings, question 1, and root cause analysis, question 2. Okay. Now, for the data source selection, you will select all the data sources that the school reviewed for the applicable pillar. So for example, if your school was identified as ATSI because of low performance in ELA, you'll want to address the ELA pillar. If it was ELA and math, you'll address those 2. If it was for chronic absenteeism, then you would address that in the joy and wellness pillar. So again, you're not addressing every single pillar, just the ones related to your dashboard identification specifically. So you'll select the data sources reviewed. It's going to be a drop-down menu. Each one that you select will display with a check mark and then populate in the box. At minimum, your school should select the California dashboard as a data source, since your identification for ATSI was based on the California dashboard indicators. So that's what we should see at minimum, that you selected the dashboard, but you can also select other data sources that connect to that. Now, if you don't see a data source listed in the dropdown, you have the option to add your own by typing in the name of the data source and then clicking on the Add New button. And once you click on that Add New button, that data that you added will appear at the bottom of the dropdown as a selectable item. You still have to go to the dropdown and select it before it can populate in the box. Once you've selected the data sources reviewed, you will complete question number 1, which is your key findings and data analysis related to the data sources that you reviewed. You will also complete question number 2, which is your root cause analysis, where you'll identify the underlying causes related to the key findings in question 1. Now, at minimum, the key findings and root cause analysis should address the California dashboard data or indicators and the student groups for which the school was identified as ATSI. So again, your focus is going to be specifically on those ATSI student groups and the dashboard indicators that they were identified for. So again, to stress this point, because I know a lot of you were identified for chronic absenteeism, we would expect that in the joy and wellness pillar, you identify and analyze key data related to student attendance. And in question 2, you would determine the root causes that impacted your student attendance. And I do want to address on that point a question that came up in our training session yesterday. It was brought up that one of the biggest contributing factors for attendance decline was COVID, which is very understandable that students were not able to attend. but we are asking you to look beyond COVID as an underlying cause and think about other mitigating factors that might have impacted student achievement, particularly when it comes to things that you can control at the school site, such as how you might monitor your attendance and provide supports to students and families to help improve your attendance. Actionable things that you can control that might help improve the attendance for the students who are identified as ATSI. So to sum up, what you're required to address in the plan are the school identification page, the recommendations and assurances tab, the comprehensive needs assessment tab, the resource inequities and evidence-based interventions tab, and only the pillar sections for which your school is identified as ATSI. Again, if you're only identified in ELA, you're only addressing the ELA pillar, for example. And within the pillar, you're only addressing 3 required sections: the data sources reviewed, key findings question number 1, and root cause analysis question number 2. Okay. Now, once you've completed all the required sections, you're ready for plan submissions. We have a separate plan submission tab. When you open that up, we'll go over how you submit your plan and how you track it. On the plan submission tab, you'll click on the Submit Plan button. If you get an error message indicating that a required plan section is incomplete, you need to correct that error before you can submit the plan to your reviewers for a review. In the example that you see here, the school did not complete all the required fields in the resource inequities and evidence-based intervention section, so it generated an error message letting the school know they have to complete it first before they can submit. When you do complete the required sections of the plan, you're going to get a green check mark on the tab letting you know that it's complete. Now, because we're not asking you to complete all the different parts of each pillar, our office, FSEP, will assist the schools by marking all the other sections of the pillar pages as NA on behalf of the school in order to help you generate those green check marks that you need to be able to submit the plan. Okay. Once the plan has been submitted successfully, a message is going to display in green text, "Plan submitted successfully," and an email notification will be sent to your regional reviewers to let them know that your plan is ready for a final review. You can track the approval of your plan on that main SPSA, on the approval tracking tab of the plan. The SPSA for non-Title I ATSI schools is only reviewed and approved by the regional Title I coordinator, the COSA or director, and the final approval, once they approve it, is done by our office, Federal and State Education Programs. Now, as each reviewer approves or requires a revision, their name with the date of the review is going to appear. So in the example you see here, the Title I coordinator approved on October 12th. As each reviewer approves or requires a revision, their name will also appear with the date of their review on the school's dashboard page. If the reviewer approves, their name is going to appear in green along with the approval date, as in the example on top. If the reviewer requires a revision, their name is going to appear in red along with that review date, like in the example in the middle. Now, each reviewer is independent of the other. So if one reviewer requires a revision, it's not going to prevent the other reviewer from approving the plan, as in the example on the bottom, where you see that all the reviewers approved it, but the COSA marked it for revisions. However, a school cannot receive final federal and state education programs approval and a board watermark seal of approval if any of the reviewers at the regional level require a revision. So you have to have all green before you can receive final approval from FSEP. Now, it is important to note that for you as a non-Title I ATSI school, we do not require approval from the PACE administrator or the EL compliance coordinator, again, it's only the regional Title I coordinator, the COSA, and final approval by FSEP. Now, in terms of the timeline for plan submission and approval, okay, right now we're in the month of February. What you want to focus on right now is reviewing items in the principal toolkit that was shared with all of you at the ATSI trainings last week that speak to your ATSI identification. So you'll want to make sure you review and understand that identification criteria. And you'll also want to start thinking about communication to parents and school staff about the identification and related mandates. In the months of February through March is when you want to focus on developing and submitting your initial SPSA plan with assistance and feedback from the Regional Title I Coordinator and our Federal and State Education Programs Office. At the end of this presentation, I'll share contact information for your Regional Title I coordinators so that you know who will be supporting you in that process. In the months of April and May, the goal is to address any feedback and revisions that are requested by your regional reviewers, your Title I coordinator and your COSA. You want to make sure that you address that feedback, make the necessary revisions so that they can approve it. And the ultimate goal is final approval of your plan before the end of June, before you go on summer break, to receive full approval for the entire plan. Now, your regional Title I coordinators may communicate an internal deadline for you for initial plan submission. Each region has their own internal deadlines by when they expect to see plans. You are getting a little more flexibility from other schools because you're a non-Title I ATSI school. So you have a little more flexibility in terms of your window, but you may receive an internal deadline from your regional Title I coordinator that they want you to submit your initial plan by. Now, I'll go through some ATSI resources before opening it up for questions. So at last week's ATSI informational sessions, we shared the ATSI Principal Toolkit, which you can access on our FSCP homepage by going to this link, clicking on State Identified Schools, and then selecting CSI ATSI Toolkit. And for you specifically, you'll want to select the ATSI Principal Toolkit. Within that toolkit, you have a lot of great resources, including reference materials that include the ATSI informational session, ESSA technical guide, and your individual school identification reports that specifically identify which student groups at your school site were identified for ATSI and which indicators it was for. You also have communication tools that include sample ATSI talking points, sample parent letters for ATSI, and a parent engagement PowerPoint to discuss your ATSI designation with your parents. We also have planning tools such as data sources, a resource inequities module and reflection questions, other resources for evidence-based interventions, and also an evidence-based intervention review tool. The toolkit also includes resources such as plan approval criteria and FAQs around your identification as an ATSI school. Our FSCP homepage also has SPSA resources in the left navigation menu. If you click on School Plan for Student Achievement, there are a lot of great helpful resources there as well. Finally, we have contact information for your regional Title I coordinators so that you know who you can connect with for additional support in developing the required sections of this plan. And you also have my contact information there at the very bottom. Okay, and with that, let me stop my screen share and stop the recording.